and welcome to ADIPEC Energy Dialogues, a series of conversations we're bringing you in the run-up to ADIPEC 2020, taking place this November. Energy Dialogues is a engagement with leading industry experts and advisors to the global oil and gas industry on the latest developments affecting the sector, with a specific focus today on innovation in the digital arena. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by David Smethurst, the former Chief Technology Officer for the energy vertical for Hitachi Vantara, which is the digital arm of Hitachi. David, welcome to Energy Dialogues.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Glad to be here.
Now, just prior to the pandemic, your role included engagement with oil and gas, energy, and concerns from around the world in context of the embracing digital innovation. I wonder if you could characterize, prior to the pandemic, the overall digital readiness of the industry to embrace digitally driven change.
Right. So there, my role was truly global, and the conversations I saw a very broad range, depending on what part of the world. They were certainly in much better shape. In Europe, there was definitely a push to be able to manage and measure their business better. In North America, long-term investments, especially upstream. But the interesting part since COVID has started is those that have been most ready are actually managing better, which is also accelerating now this agenda for digitization, which has been quite interesting.
Now, when you say ready for digital change, I wonder if you might characterize that a bit further for me. What does it? What does that mean? In other words, if I were engaging or we were having a meeting with an oil and gas concern, how would you gauge their actual readiness to deal with digital change?
Sure. So in regards to action, I use the term manage and measure. That means the information they are gathering. So the data management and data ingestion, and be able to do something with that information is really important these days, not just from the asset coming from a wellhead, but the communication within the company, within their supply chain, within the collaboration as a services company works with an upstream company. And so be able to do that and also work with partners that, for instance, may be providing the ability to real-time data capture. So you're looking at, say, monitoring a pipeline or doing various types of monitoring. That ability, that remoteness. So if you think of what the digital oil field vision was many years ago, was that ability to have a level of automation to remove risk, better access to information, better decision-making. That's there, companies are ahead with that, but certainly other regions in the world are a little further along. It's not that we've been laggards in the industry. It's still, we're looking at those outcome-driven ideas from our technology.
Now, if we move beyond the upstream to the midstream, is there a difference or a distinction there?
Yes. So upstream was always the side of the business, both on the IT side, so back office, as well as any ways of improving and lowering those costs of their whole development programs. And because they are collaborating with partners like the drilling companies and services companies. They've invested. And what we've seen recently, though, in the last year or so, midstream have looked at artificial intelligence to improve that process of bringing a pipeline on or shutting it down for any kind of servicing or dealing with various issues. And that's really important, Jeffrey, because the time to be able to manage that, shortening that cycle, reduces, again, a lot of the risk as they manage flow and pressure.
And it's not just flow and pressure too, but there's an energy consumption that goes along with pushing product through a pipeline. And in an era of attention to low carbon emissions, reduction in energy usage in these assets actually is accretive to an energy carbon budget that a company may have in place.
Absolutely. And you and I were on a panel earlier this year, and certainly the whole idea of managing and measuring the business, when you look at climate change, you look at managing the information as companies start vocalizing being zero emissions in 30 years. And so if you have all these pieces together, you are certainly managing and measuring much better and taking out that risk.
And so as the energy industry goes through its cycles, different economic drivers rise in importance and others fall. Which drivers are actually the most important in the cycle today? Is it a reduction in cost? Is it improving volumes? Is it improving sustainability?
Well, every time I'm being asked a similar question, I think of cumulative effects. So the whole model around the economics of doing anything in the oil and gas industry, the environmental impact, and of course the social impact. And when I look at the oil and gas industry today, they are most concerned obviously about cost, but they're also the risk part of it. I was part of a conversation last year where the reinsurers were trying to understand how they better insure the risk in an energy environment. And when I look at the ability for these companies to focus on digital transformation, what's come up in a lot of recent conversations is the more you digitize, the higher risk you create in that world of cybersecurity. So in all honesty, they're seeing these operations outcomes come together, but they're you know, the technology OT side of things is starting to come into balance. And now that's where I'm saying what I've seen just since COVID started, the conversation is going more operations focused. That includes a cost benefit.
Some infrastructure in oil and gas, of course, has been in place for many, many years. I'm thinking about offshore platforms, oil refineries, and other plant. How ready are these facilities to cope with digital change?
Right. So I'm going to go just from my experience because I want to look at what I, as a part of an event earlier this year in the North Sea, commenting and having a conversation around that. There are ways to digitize that. Video analytics and surveillance is one of those areas. Certainly you're seeing that in the downstream side in North America, where formal digital planning started early last year. And so, so they're finding ways and having, instead of ripping and replacing, they are finding different ways to be able to improve on any kind of predictive failures on pumps, et cetera, and even managing the supply chain of those environments.
And is that driven by the availability of digital infrastructure on site, or are
Yes.
those organizations leveraging, say, assets that may be available to them in a cloud environment?
Well, the cloud environment is, and that's a really good point, the cloud environment's given them that opportunity to scale and to standardize. So if I had a refinery in North America and I had other operations outside of that, I was able to take advantage of that. I was able to duplicate a lot of what I've already invested in. And as I say, one of the busiest areas that we had as a group in the last 3 years was the video analytics side of it. And this, they could take advantage of the smart cameras they already may have had in place with security. They're now putting that into an operational role.
And the use of those cameras, for instance, could be to assist with scheduling and managing the arrival of vessels, for instance, in an offshore setting, in addition to vapor detection of rogue emissions, that sort of thing?
Yes, because the technology has advanced a lot. And one of the comments I'll certainly say in this former role, we really wanted to deal with current state. So technology that was available today, and we really called it edge to outcome. We were working with existing infrastructure and adding with what could be delivered today, sometimes as a service, because you looked at the CapEx, OpEx models that customers were experiencing, going back to your earlier question about cost management. Cost management also means, though, that you have something that's sustainable and scalable. And so they'll reap those rewards. And again, it's certainly happening right now as we are adjusting the business plans based on demand and price and all those things. And the common theme I'm hearing is let's start reducing those peaks and valleys as we get post-COVID. And common theme right now is the demand will go back considerably, but let's be better prepared.
And of the technologies that are out there, I mean, there are literally hundreds of digital innovations available to industry. Were there any that were particularly on point or more readily adopted or used by oil and gas as a way of getting into the digital world?
I'll go back to the big conversations were last year, of course, big data. So the data management side, big data was probably top of mind. And I can honestly say 100% of the conversations I would have either with ministries that were focused on energy to large oil and gas, the data management side was still a concern, and realizing that they had a lot of big data that they were looking at these IoT strategies and wanting to be able to do more with them, better insight. And I know that even though the IoT agenda has been going for a few years, I certainly even saw at the World IoT Congress a lot of better outcomes, especially in 2019, that we were a part of, as well as with partners. And so I would say that that's still remains, if you even follow any of the blogs, et cetera. The data side is really important.
And beyond data, of course, big data, that drives us into people who really understand data. So data science and the like. Is that an element of the story here around big data?
Yes, it is. But what's really interesting, and which I'm really was glad to see, the oil and gas companies came to realize not only are they going to borrow success in the horizontal world of technology and put the vertical context, they're also moving around the employee. So from a role point of view, we were seeing these crossover groups. So you'd see someone from the field, someone with a little more technology focus, and they're now collaborating internally along with their partners. And the nice thing was, when I was referring to edge to outcome, focusing on what is the outcome you're looking for, and then look at what you can do to enable that. Instead of these things, these expectations out of the box that have limitations. And so, you know, being that translator was really a big part of my role, because if I'm a senior executive, I don't want to hear more about product. I want to hear more about outcomes.
And in that raises a good question. In that outcome, that question about outcomes, what was the outcome that big data was held out as the way to get to a specific solution? What was the prize that most oil and gas companies were aiming at through understanding their data resources?
Sure. I'll give you a good example. In not so long ago, as we were gathering that data and doing the analytics, there were big delays. You know, time, it could be weeks. So we were bringing weeks down to minutes. And so, you know, what that operational dollar per hour costs in an upstream environment, just time alone was one. Other scenarios were preventive. So getting, you know, reducing the number of safety incidents, for instance, as people are now actually monitoring their work through video analytics and seeing that real time. Right down to the wellbore, you know, as they're drilling and looking at bringing a well on, anything in reducing incidents and or time, big savings, right? And some even further downstream, when you're looking at, they're redoing with this big data, what a reservoir potentially, what its life looks like, you know, and, you know, that was a big dream that is starting to become a reality.
And of course, hand in hand with big data is the ability to interpret that data, which
Yes.
I suspect is another element. What innovations were you seeing that were in tandem with big data for the interpretation of those data assets?
Well, is the question more on the subsurface, like the G&G world, the geological and geophysical side?
Well, of course,
that's already been that really wasn't a big part of that. As a matter of fact, the advancement of that part of the world has been a strong suit upstream, right? It's more about you've now got your flow, and you've got, you know, putting into pipelines, you're actually managing that asset and all the supply chain that goes with it. I mean, you and I have had conversations even about looking at the blockchain, different ways of bringing some efficiency from the financial side to the operational side.
Yeah. So it's really big data. Big data meets big compute,
right.
which was all, you know, the subsurface always had that. Now we actually can bring that world together for other parts of the industry.
That's right. And you think of an asset team in an oil and gas company, you know, all of them being you know, quote unquote on the same page is more of a reality. And they can also do that, just like you and I are doing that today. They can do it remotely. Right. And as I say, many of the conversations are, we've been working at this for a number of years. We're now testing it in this current environment, and we're now being able to identify some of these areas that we can accelerate or invest in that makes more sense. Right. But I'll go back to that translating part, Jeffrey. We're even in the conversations advisory work today, it's not about talking technology for the sake of technology. It really is taking a look at what are we wanting to solve. Right, predictive failure in a pump on a, you know, reducing time on a shutdown, you know, those are things that make a lot of sense for the business people.
Let's turn now to this question of how the pandemic has disrupted plans to invest in digital or drive digital change. And the pandemic can have a couple effects, I believe. One would be to accelerate an existing agenda. Another may be to take the agenda and move it in a quite different direction, because my hypothesis would be very, very few oil and gas concerns had built their digital innovation plans around the potential threat of a pandemic. And so there's been a need to kind of revector here. Help me understand a bit how you see the impact of the pandemic on oil and gas.
Okay, certainly. So I'm going to base it actually on conversations from, things were somewhat normal in January to today. And why I say that is we already knew that the industry, based on demand and oil prices, were struggling. So a lot of the oil and gas companies were already looking at different ways to manage through a cycle. And so the demand, again, depending on what the balance sheet looked like, and every company was different, every parts of the world were different, there was this concern around what was demand going to be like based on price. And you look at the whole shale business in the U.S., there's a lot of things in play at the beginning of the year. So now what I am seeing firsthand is the realization that the investment of digital, based on today's market and cost, is a lot less than it was before. But let's pick the ones, again, we'll go back to these outcome-driven ideas. Let's look at where that comes into play for our business, right? And certainly in the North American marketplace, that is still an investment, but you now have operations, finance, and IT working together. This is not, I repeat, not a technology play here. It is an operations improvement play, and improvement versus change. And I think a lot of people come to realize that. And as a matter of fact, a couple of senior people I've talked to are quite pleased at how they're, even demographically across the board, those that are working from home are doing a great job of leveraging the technology they have or understanding the conversation of what they need.
Now, it's been the practice in the industry that individuals working on a project will congregate onto a project team in a specific location to do that work. Obviously, that's no longer practical or possible. Does this mean that for the most part, project work that had been underway has been shut down, or are companies pushing through and saying, well, we don't have a choice. We are going to live through this pandemic. We may as well keep to business as usual. How do you characterize, or how are you seeing companies react in that fashion? Are we seeing projects shut down, or are they being accelerated?
Again, I'll go from personal experience. As soon as this all came on, projects did shut down. It was more a reaction. The world did not understand what they're up against. But many of the business side said, hey, we just can't totally drop everything. We need to plan. And you often would hear the terminology, the new normal. And now the new normal is going to be a better view of how we manage things. And so what I've been seeing is people have accepted that the group side of things from a project point of view will be a little bit different. But what is quite interesting, there are a few companies with project management focus that integrates with the other components of their business, accelerating, doing very well. There's a couple in play today that I know, even with the current challenges, are still growing because this particular companies that are based, that are global companies, they're not huge, but they've got a niche area that they are addressing as part of the digital side of it. So very project focused. And that seems to be a gap that's getting filled, was pre-COVID, now certainly earning its stripes as this continues. And the latest information is it will continue well into 2021. And then we now have new business practices that we could manage any major change, I think.
And relative to thinking about social distancing phenomenon, relative to the normal of video conferencing now, which is a standard way of business engagement,
Mhm.
what other innovations have you seen that have had particularly positive and immediate impact on the fortunes of the industry during the pandemic?
Wow, that's a very good question, Jeffrey. It almost all seems to be the urgency around communication. In all honesty, some of these, like I mentioned, about the project side or the cybersecurity side, because people are conversing, what are my risks and things along those lines. So I would say firsthand, nothing really stands out. One area is accelerating another, and as I say, right now in some recent conversations in industry, the cybersecurity part has done well for, we mentioned big data before. If you're really going to delve into the data you have and create an exponential amount more of data, that cybersecurity strategy is going to be very important, more so than it ever has been, because the more the companies invest in that level of automation. But otherwise, and I think this is actually a good thing, because I mentioned the word POC versus POV. I think the industry is a little tired of getting more concepts. They would prefer value. And I think those topics that were bantered around in the last 3 years, we mentioned before, IoT and big data and et cetera, they're now getting some maturity that show benefit. So
that's a real positive. One thing I have noticed is that contact tracing, which
yes,
is a public health feature in many economies, try and
right,
track down where people have been. That's a capability that could prove to be very valuable in a company context, particularly one where there's a lot of contractors and other non-permanent employees who are working in contact with a permanent employee base.
yes.
That sort of contact tracing becomes an element of a company's response to the pandemic, which could itself be digitally enabled.
That's a very good point, actually. And there, we were working on a similar project like that in South Africa. And a lot of it being because of the contractor situation and of identifying roles in different places, and again, how they would pay and manage all the resources they had, and be able to manage the ups, the peaks and the valleys through that cycle.
Now, the pandemic, there, as we all know, is having a very, very profound effect in the short term. What is your longer term outlook for these digitally driven changes now in oil and gas? Are they likely to stay permanent? Are they temporary and they'll be rolled back as a vaccine eventually emerges and we have the opportunity to go back to the way things were?
Right.
Are these digital changes actually likely to be more permanent than we think?
Right. And well, and that is again, a very good question, and one that is being asked quite a bit these days, because I think what we knew prior to the pandemic is in the past. I think the best practices, I think of a lot of the business people today that are, whether they're in the consulting side of things, et cetera, realize that this was a big reset. And this reset means, we had a lot of these things available. The sense of urgency wasn't there. Now, when we are really looking into this, we can't afford to step back or return back to anything that was, quote unquote, the normal. And so, and these not only from the conversations, it's also from one thing in the COVID world, you have a lot more time to read, to see and have a conversation like this, and of course, great reports are coming out, even from the large oil and gas companies who are very cognizant of the next 30 years, going to renewables, et cetera. So that new normal, which I'm not really fond of, but let's just say the new reality, I think over the next 5 to 10 years, because oil and gas demand, we know fossil fuel demand, as a matter of fact, in one of the recent articles, 84% of the energy is still requiring fossil fuel, and you have your petroleum-based products. We just need to manage it better. And this reset in digital is giving us that opportunity to show the world that we are managing and measuring much better than people understand. So this is a good story, but all of us wake up with an energy expectation that lights will work and cars will work, whether they're electric or otherwise. This is where the future is going. It's just giving us that step up.
And as you kind of look forward to the future with these digital innovations in place, what is the outlook for talent and people who are working in the industry? Should they be planning and adding to their own personal skill set so that they are, say, more future-proof and as the world unfolds?
I absolutely think so. I mean, regardless of demographic, I just see how people operate with their personal computers, with their phones or smartphones. This is just an extension of that. And as people start to understand, because a lot of this is pervasive, right? So even the analytics, when the data they're creating and they're now looking at reports, I mean, a lot of the new technology, the artificial intelligence technology, it is much easier to manage. It is in the cloud. It is very scalable, and it certainly meets the ability to standardize regardless, again, of the demographic. My kids' age, they're either in university or finished university, they'll say they understand it better, but in reality, the combination of the field and operations experience and the technology enablement, I think people have already started. I think that kind of training and that availability, I mean, I even look what you've been involved in to continue to update people on what these technologies really are and why they're important, right? People are learning, whether it's a formal course, et cetera. There's a lot of available information. And I think people are doing more of that. And the pandemic's lent that opportunity to do that. Matter of fact, companies have kept people so they can get retrained better.
There's the talent that we need to run the industry because of the transition effect as we go through from today to the future. We're going to need effectively a new skill set for our future world, but we also have to maintain the skill set we have for our existing world, and getting that balance right is a critical new risk. What other risks, aside from that talent risk, and of course you've mentioned cyber risks, which are rising, what other risks are top of mind for you when you think about the introduction of digital innovations into this industry?
Right. The big risk that I think is being recognized is how they ensure that risk, meaning, operationally, it's such a capital intensive industry. And so, the economic models are changing. And so the risk is now that people that are going to lead lead these companies are going to have to be not only resourceful, but they're also going to have to take on a whole new leadership style, I think, because this transition into the future of energy is what we're talking about today, and digital is important to that. But the leadership side of it, and I just know because, demographically, of the leaders I was a part of over the last 30 years, a lot of them are transitioning out. And I know even search firms that I've had recent conversations with are also wanting to know what the digital leadership will look like, what type of advisory they're going to have, and how well informed they are of what risk means. Is it on the health and safety side? Is it on the financial side, right? Am I actually able to report better, with all this technology? So I would say that is a big concern, is we've got to know that we're leading, communicating in an area that people rely on, whether you're in a developing country or you're in a first world country.
David, I'd like to thank you for coming on Energy Dialogues today and sharing your perspectives around the world of digital in oil and gas.
My pleasure, Jeffrey.
This has been another episode of Energy Dialogues, and join us again for future episodes as we carry out these interviews and conversations with leading experts and analysts in the industrial world in the run-up to ADIPEC 2020. Bye for now.